The score is 28-9. People like to talk about 28-3, but no, sorry, I'm gonna have to be a snob about this. Many people won't taste the difference, but if you want the best of the best, reach for the vintage and go for 28-9. I think you'll enjoy it. It's the highest anyone's ever been, with a minute and a half left in the third quarter of Super Bowl 51, largely because of what immediately precedes it. The New England Patriots have finally scored a touchdown. Down 25 points, they needed it quickly. What they produced instead was this arduous, lurching drive full of runs and short passes that ran more than 6 of the remaining 23 minutes off the clock. Minutes they just do not have to spare. When Tom Brady finally drops one into James White from 5 yards out, well, sure, it's the very least they can do. So they set up for the extra point and trot out Stephen Gostkowski, one of the most automatic kickers of all time, to complete the paperwork. Yeah, NFL rules now set the distance for the extra point a few yards back from where it used to be, but paperwork is still all we see it as. When he clangs it off the right upright, it makes the sound you hear when you're attempting to close the program without saving your work. You can literally hear them losing. After all that, the Patriots still can't bring it to double digits. It just is not their night. On the next play, the Patriots further debased themselves by lining up for the onside kick, one of the most graceless and stupid-looking things in the world of sports. If the extra point is paperwork, the onside kick is, check fraud. Your job is to kick it to yourself, but the rules say you have to kick it at least 10 yards, so you have to make it bounce as awkwardly as possible before you pick it up.
What we're about to see is a level of desperation rarely seen in football. A team in such dire straits that they felt compelled to kick onside before the game has even reached the fourth quarter. It's something that, if you're lucky, carried about a 20% success rate back then. While the Pats don't initially telegraph their intentions with personnel, they do show a look that they typically don't on kickoffs, with 4 Patriots bunched tightly on either side of kicker Stephen Gostkowski. That should be an obvious sign of what's about to happen. Yet, the Falcons are lined up like it's a regular old kickoff. When the Pats stay in this look, even as Gostkowski approaches the ball, it removes any ambiguity. But somehow, the Falcons initially retreat even after Gostkowski strikes the ball. It's like the mere idea of an onside kick has never even crossed Atlanta's mind. And it just doesn't matter. Everything's been coming up Falcons, and everything's continuing to come up Falcons. They recover the kick, still stumbling into doing the one final thing they needed to do to extinguish the one remaining molecule of doubt. This is now a formality. All they have to do is dot some I's and cross some T's on the last page of paperwork to acquire their very own shiny new Vince Lombardi trophy.
After living in New York for a little over 2 years, I just knew I had to be back home in Atlanta to watch the Falcons try to pull off the unthinkable. I had to be surrounded by my people to fully appreciate what I was watching. I mean, as a Falcons fan, this is a moment that rarely happens. The last time my team made the Super Bowl, I was a snot-nosed 6-year-old, barely comprehending the full importance of the big game. Fast forward almost 20 years later, there was no chance I would pass on the opportunity to watch the team that I grew up with go for it all in the city that I love. And what I was watching was pure domination. Not only were the Falcons crushing it on all levels, but they were doing it against the goddamn Patriots. Seeing the smug look wiped off Tom Brady's face was pure bliss. For a moment, it seems as if my friends and I were the happiest we had been in our entire lives. There was talks of which one of the finest, let's just say clubs that Atlanta has to offer that we would go to celebrate at. This was a moment that a city and a franchise had been waiting on for years, and it was finally happening.
Now Atlanta takes over, already on the fringe of field goal range thanks to their onside kick recovery. If the Patriots want to even fantasize about winning this ballgame, okay, here's what it'll take. First, it will require holding the Falcons offense, a unit whose 540 points constituted one of the NFL's 10 greatest ever scoring seasons, without points for at least 3, possibly 4, consecutive possessions, barring future onside kick recoveries. Well, not including those that were terminated due to the end of a half, the 2016 Falcons had 160 drives. They scored on 92 of them, over 57%, while rarely going more than even 2 consecutive possessions without putting points on the board. Oh, and New England's got to combine that Herculean defensive effort with squeezing in, at a minimum, 2 touchdowns, 2 two-point conversions, and a field goal of their own just to force overtime. The Atlanta Falcons have finally done it.
Comfortably in Patriots territory, the brilliant Matt Ryan immediately finds tight end Austin Hooper for a 9-yard gain. Maybe they'll end this drive with a touchdown, or maybe they'll settle for a field goal. And field goal might be more tasteful. Either way, it's time to stamp this envelope and ship it. This isn't just any Super Bowl, because this isn't just any point in history. What happens on this field tonight is inseparable from the political climate at this time. There are millions of people who, still reeling from a crushing material defeat, are clinging to these Atlanta Falcons for at least some purely symbolic victory, however small. These people have been big Falcons fans for precisely 2 weeks. Some are fans of other teams who have hopped on the bandwagon. Some couldn't even tell you the rules of American football. Millions more have been die-hard Falcons loyalists for decades. Through every euphoric rise, nauseating collapse, weirdo head coach, electrifying athlete, and bewildering turn of events. This moment, though, is a first. Nearing the fourth quarter, the Falcons are up huge. It's a victory procession very few players or fans ever get to experience. After spending their entire 51-year existence, off in a distant world, completely isolated from real consequence, the Atlanta Falcons have spent the last 2 months destroying all comers and playing their way directly into the center of the universe. Few teams have ever played on a stage this large, and few teams have ever looked so invincible. This is an exhilarating, perfect moment. So let's just take a minute to enjoy it. Let's stay a little while. Something happens when you draw a line through North Georgia that runs exactly north-south. It doesn't even need to be more than a few hundred yards wide. Up in Cherokee County, there's a town named Ball Ground, so named because the Cherokee people play games of Anetsa in this area. Anetsa is a Cherokee variant of stickball, and its meaning, little brother of war, is appropriate. It was sometimes thought of as a stand-in for war, a substitute that would actually resolve disputes over things like property, or perhaps even land, without resorting to actual conflict. It was an elegant solution that seems eons ahead of its time. There's a report of one particular match held in 1834, making it perhaps one of the last great Anetsa games before the Cherokee were forced out of their homeland by the United States government. It sounds so much like the football that would follow a century and a half later. The object of the game was to send the ball through the goalposts. It was played by 18 on each side, typically on Saturday afternoons in the fall, on a field that stretched a little longer than 100 yards. Everyone turned out to watch. $1,000 bets were placed on the game. Before and during the match, cultural traditions dominated the proceedings. Supporters cast spells on their opponents, not unlike today's fans who spend all week talking trash at their rival. It's easy to look at sports today and think of them as a corporate invention, but they're no more of an invention than singing, dancing, acting, or any of the other things that make us human. These are things that have always been part of us, and always will. In the ensuing decades, the oppressors who stole all this land fought over it and ultimately destroyed it. Almost exactly due south of this spot, nearly 100 years later, we see another collection of athletes harnessing sports as an alternative to warfare. The Great War is destroying Europe, as humans have invented horrifying new ways to maim and kill each other. America is being dragged in, and the future of the entire world is uncertain. And all the while, one man is unbothered. John Heisman is in the lab. Georgia Tech's head coach has spent the war years building one of the first great American sports dynasties. Much more importantly, he spent his time in Atlanta evolving the sport of football into the game that we recognize today. He's perfecting the forward pass, a rule he spent years tirelessly advocating for. He's insisting on 4 quarters instead of 2 halves. He's telling his quarterbacks to yell hike before they take the snap. He's telling his centers to actually snap the ball to the quarterback instead of rolling it to him on the ground. It was as though there was no war in Europe, or any Europe at all. Instead, Heisman was obsessed with the beauty of football, a thing that's kind of like stabilized war in a controlled, non-lethal state. It gave every violent thing inside of people a place to go. In these 2 moments, sports served as a sort of refuge, an alternative to conflict, mostly untouched by the realities of the time and place. And it's appropriate that along this thin little ray of time, we see it happen a 3rd time, half a century later. You know all about it. In the 1960s, the war in Vietnam is scaling up. Americans are perpetually worried that they're on the brink of nuclear annihilation. At home, art and culture are being turned upside down. Politics are beginning to fracture in a way that will later prove permanent. Women are fighting for equal rights. The South, and Atlanta in particular, is a focal point of the civil rights movement. And swooping directly into the middle of all of it, like a lost bird in a Kmart, are these Atlanta Falcons. This logo will eventually be redesigned into something sleeker and more aggressive, but for now it's perfect. The beady-eyed face, the dopey, somewhat mortified facial expression. It looks like it walked into the wrong restroom. Regardless, the city of Atlanta rallied around this big fella.
And in a city as diverse as Atlanta, a lot of the fans don't have much in common but looking forward to Sundays. From the wealthy suburbs of North Atlanta to the forgotten streets of East Atlanta, people with vastly different upbringings and values, whether racially or economically, toss that to the side in the name of the Falcons. I may not personally know you and what you stand for, but for 4 quarters, if you're rocking black and red, we're family. Falcons fans are like the parents of a disappointing child. The team may fall flat on their face over and over, but we'll always begrudgingly be there to show support and love. We can talk shit about our team because that's our child, but don't you dare speak ill of them if you're not part of the family, because one day we hope they'll finally get it right, and when they do, we'll be there.
It was only a matter of time. For decades, the AFL and the NFL had avoided the South, which was considered to be college football territory. Major pro football mostly kept to the Northeast and Midwest, with a couple of ventures into California. It wasn't until 1960 that they finally put teams in Texas. Take away the map and it's not even clear that the South exists. But in terms of economy and population, the region was getting too big to ignore. When the Falcons moved in with their baseball counterparts, the Braves, both became the teams of the South. There just wasn't anyone else around. To this day, step into a hole-in-the-wall bar or diner in Alabama or Tennessee or the Carolinas, and you still might see ancient Falcons and Braves stuff on the wall. It was all theirs. Land nobody else wanted. It was brought there by insurance exec and Atlanta native Rankin Smith after he put up $8.5 million, which at the time was the highest price ever paid for an American sports franchise. One of his first moves was such an ambitious one that 50 years later it sounds like a joke. He was going to hire the most famous coach on earth. Vince Lombardi's Green Bay Packers had won 2 NFL championships, and they were on their way to a 3rd when Smith called him up to hire him away. He just went for it. Most amazingly, it almost worked. According to Smith, they'd shook hands on bringing Lombardi to the Falcons, and the media reported that it was just about a done deal. Of course, Lombardi reconsidered, stayed with the Packers, won the NFL championship that season, then won Super Bowl I, then won Super Bowl II. But before he did, Lombardi recommended his assistant coach for the job. Smith listened, figuring that if he couldn't have Vince Lombardi as the Falcons' first head coach, he'd get the next best thing. His name was Norb. Alright, here's what we're looking at. See this guy here? This line? That's 500. The break-even point. That's where you are if you've won exactly as many games as you've lost. As the winningest team in NFL history, the Packers are somewhere way up there. Now, here's the first Falcons game in 1966. They are now officially below 500. Here they are finishing their first season with a 3-11 record. In the 54 seasons that have followed, they have never made it back to that line. You know what we always say around here. Who cares?
The Falcons followed up that inaugural 1966 campaign in which they lost 11 of 14 games by losing 12 of 14 games in each of the next 2 seasons. Now, you'd expect any new expansion squad to struggle for a while until they get their feet under them, but you wouldn't expect this. It just gets worse and worse the more you examine. So, let's examine more. Here you can see, relative to the rest of the league, exactly how bad their offense was at scoring points, and exactly how good their defense was at allowing points. This is how that manifested itself in each of their 42 games through those first 3 seasons. It's a thing of beauty. In nearly a third of them, they just chose to drink that Romeo and Juliet potion and play dead, with 11 different losses by at least 30 points. The biggest win the Falcons of this era had was simply in getting their first ever draft pick to sign on the dotted line of a contract. When they selected University of Texas All-American linebacker Tommy Nobis first overall in the 1966 NFL Draft, they were competing just to secure his rights with the AFL's Houston Oilers, who'd also drafted him 10 minutes later in their league's draft. Nobis was an incredible player who both teams desperately wanted. The Oilers put the full court press on, utilizing an astronaut to recruit him while in outer space. Owner Bud Adams used his deep oil pockets to make a more appealing offer. He even said if Nobis chose Houston, he'd take him on his plane and let him sign his contract above his collegiate stadium. Ultimately, Nobis chose Atlanta in the more highly regarded NFL, and he went on to become a perennial Pro Bowler and one of the great Falcons of all time, even if that caused some astronomical sadness.
When Hecker was fired 3 games into the 1968 season, he was so damn happy. He was finally free after a head coaching tenure that had resulted in 4 wins and 26 losses. This wasn't totally a referendum on Hecker's coaching ability. He'd later join the Niners coaching staff and win multiple Super Bowls there. It's just that brand new teams lose a lot. Regardless though, no coach with this long a leash had ever done this much losing. When the 504 coaches who have ever coached in an NFL game are plotted by their wins and losses, Norb Hecker's 4-26 record is all by itself.
A big driver of those first few dark seasons, as you might expect, was poor quarterback play. The first QB in franchise history was Randy Johnson, who the Falcons bookended with Nobis to close out the 1966 NFL Draft's first round. He was arguably the worst quarterback each of his first 2 seasons, posting identical passer ratings of 47.8 in each. Then an injury-plagued third season in 1968 opened the door for backup Bob Berry's first career extended playing time, and he also underwhelmed. But he was better than Johnson and was named the starter for the 1969 season. Berry and then Johnson would each get hurt and replace one another, but they played surprisingly well when healthy. As a result, the Falcons, outscored by over 200 points in each of their previous 3 seasons, actually outscored their opposition in year 4. They sorta just treaded water over the next 3 years with Berry under center before trading him to Minnesota in a deal to acquire quarterback Bob Lee in 1973. Lee lost out on the starting gig to Dick Shiner to open the season, but after dropping 3 of their first 4 games, Lee replaced Shiner, and the Falcons immediately went on a lengthy winning streak. Lee's hold on the job would be short-lived, though. In 1974, he was benched multiple times for Pat Sullivan, but Sullivan struggled mightily as well and also got yanked late in the season. Enter their formerly third-string rookie out of Lehigh, Kim McQuilkin.
This is where we talk about the Atlanta Falcons passing attack in the mid-70s, which was bad in ways that are impossible to imagine today. I mean, if you made current Falcons quarterback Matt Ryan throw into a 35-man defense, he'd probably still come up with better stats than what we're about to see. I'm serious. At this early point in the story, I'd like to urge you to cherish this. Though it might seem like it now, this is not the story of a team that's perpetually hapless and awful. In the future, the Atlanta Falcons are going to do a whole lot of winning and a whole lot of contending. This is the one and only time we're going to go long on a Falcons team that deeply, genuinely sucks ass. There's a strange sort of beauty in that. Enjoy it while it lasts.
McQuilkin closed out a Week 12 loss to the Rams and threw 3 interceptions in the second half, bringing his career total to 4 on just 34 attempts. But Liam Sullivan had been so disastrous all year that the Falcons figured they had nothing to lose and kept McQuilkin in the lineup for the final 2 games to see what he could do. First, the good news. They were in the midst of a 7-game losing streak when he took over, and they split his 2 starts. Now, the bad news. Another 5 of his passes were intercepted. That brought his rookie season to a close with his 79 passes generating just 373 yards, with 9 of them being picked off while still searching for his first career touchdown pass. Combined with miserable play out of Liam Sullivan, who together threw 22 picks against 4 touchdowns, the 1974 Falcons passing offense was dreadful. Like, really dreadful. The NFL's 32 teams have combined to play 1,509 seasons since the AFL and NFL merged in 1970. Here's the passing proficiency of each and every one based on passer rating and adjusted net yards per attempt. Over 99% came in with a passer rating above 40, and most that didn't were at least close and at least had an adjusted net yards per attempt above 1. And then we have the 1974 Atlanta Falcons with a passer rating under 28 and a negative adjusted yards per attempt. Yeah, there's one squad, the 1977 Tampa Bay Buccaneers, that was even worse than they were. But as for the other 1,507, the 74 Falcons are complete outcasts from them. With their thorough inability to get anything going through the air, Atlanta had to turn to the draft to try and find some sort of answer at quarterback. And there was really only one strong option to pursue: the University of California's Steve Bartkowski. Sitting with the 3rd overall selection in the 1975 NFL Draft, and unable to afford missing out on the top prospect, to guarantee their ability to draft him, the Falcons had to ship one of the league's top offensive linemen, George Coons, along with the number 3 pick to the Colts to land the 1st overall pick. Seeking a new franchise quarterback after a season like Atlanta had in 1974 is understandable, as they were beyond atrocious through the air. But if they'd just been regular bad instead of that bad, they wouldn't have felt so much pressure to get a QB. Perhaps they could have instead kept their standout tackle, kept their 3rd overall pick, and taken, say, a dazzling running back prospect out of Jackson State by the name of Walter Payton. Anyway, midway through Bartkowski's rookie season, he dislocated his elbow, creating another chance for McQuilkin to play. Although he did throw his first career touchdown in relief against Cincy, it was overshadowed by 3 picks, and a listless first half the next week in New Orleans got him benched at halftime. With Bartkowski still shelved for another couple weeks and a trip to Minnesota on deck, McQuilkin was reinserted into the starting lineup. Entering that game, he'd thrown 13 career interceptions against just 1 touchdown, but we hadn't seen anything yet. Things may have been wobbly before, but here's where the wheels completely fall off. McQuilkin attempted 26 passes, completing 5 to each team for 43 yards with no touchdowns. Those 5 interceptions ensured him a passer rating on the day of 0.0. However, he was playing against the defending conference champion Vikings and their terrifying purple people eaters on defense. Like, Hall of Fame defensive end Carl Eller makes quarterbacks' lives miserable enough as a pass rusher, it's really not fair for him to also snag the only pick of his career right here by throwing a big paw up there on this screen pass and coming down with it. This was a really brutal game, so let's show some mercy and pretend that didn't happen. Okay, so he threw 4 picks. Oh, still 0. Maybe a receiver ran a bad route or deflected a well-thrown ball. That happens. Okay then, let's take a 2nd interception off the board. Oh. In a somber post-game scene, McQuilkin had no words. Even reporters were speechless. McQuilkin returned the next year, and a month into the 76 season, Bartkowski suffered a season-ending knee injury. More McQuilkin. He played a lot like the previous 2 years and was eventually yanked from the lineup in a season that marked the final extensive playing time of his career. By passer rating and adjusted net yards per attempt, McQuilkin's first 3 seasons likely constituted 3 of the 4 worst by any quarterback to throw at least 60 passes in a campaign since the merger. Despite his level of play, McQuilkin wasn't one of the worst players or even quarterbacks in NFL history. For one, he managed to hang around the NFL for 7 years before voluntarily retiring, when most players are lucky to have a career half that long. Additionally, as underscored by the pitiful 1974 Falcons passing game whose ineptitude Bob Lee and Pat Sullivan were more responsible for than McQuilkin, he was embedded within a terrible offensive infrastructure in which all other men brave enough to try and play quarterback for the Falcons during the mid-70s also struggled immensely. His protection wasn't up to snuff, and he had zero coaching staff stability. What's ironic is that despite his noteworthy struggles during his time in the NFL, in the big picture, very few people have been as successful at as wide a variety of endeavors as Kim McQuilkin has. The man excelled in everything he tried his hand at after his playing days came to a close. First as a football analyst, then in becoming an executive with Cartoon Network, then in starting his own toy company that licensed merchandise for movies, then in presiding over a supply chain consulting business. And whereas plenty of non-stars don't stand out in any way and have boring, forgettable careers, McQuilkin's career lent itself to the creation of some fascinating charts for a documentary made about his Falcons nearly 50 years after he played for them. God, I love Kim McQuilkin.
I do too. This is our official editorial position. Kim McQuilkin rules. Now, all this decidedly subpar quarterbacking cuts even deeper once we consider who was actually presiding over most of it. Between 68 and 74, their head coach was not that far removed from a Hall of Fame career as a quarterback. In fact, many at the time considered him to be the best quarterback ever. Even before being subjected to all this horrendous passing happening right in front of him, this man was already established as one of the crankiest individuals ever to walk the earth. A big old crusty Dutchman who'd cuss you out as soon as look at you. Take just a minute to imagine what such a man might look like. How'd you do? Across all sports, the 1970s were a golden age for crabby red-ass coaches, and Norm Van Brocklin might have been the best of the best. He smoked like a chimney on the sideline. Who's gonna tell him no? This man was a former 2-time NFL champion quarterback, spending most of his playing days in Los Angeles, a place he hated because hippies confounded him. In fact, Norm hated everything that was less than 9,000 years old. He hated it when quarterbacks scrambled instead of standing in the pocket. When Lions kicker and Cyprus native Garo Yepremian used a newly introduced soccer-style kick to beat him, he wanted the government to take a hard line against the Cypriots. When the NFL merged with the AFL, his read on the situation was that the NFL was stupid, and also that the AFL was stupid. It couldn't have been easy for a guy who did so much winning as a player to do so much losing as a coach. His first stop was with the Minnesota Vikings, and seeing as they were a brand new franchise, Van Brocklin was able to draft players from other teams. There were a bunch of stiffs, he said, about the players he himself selected. After a few years of losing, he quit, then came back the next day and said he was a fighter, not a quitter, and then he lost some more and then he quit. Strangely, during his time in Atlanta, the press actually seemed to kinda like the guy, despite him calling them whores and sons of bitches, and on one reported occasion grabbing them by the necktie. As an orator, he could stop on a dime and fly off the handle without warning. One of his post-game locker room speeches started with "I'm proud of you boys," and then immediately veered into a rant about how the Atlanta media apparatus was conspiring against him that involved multiple invocations of the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. He concluded with a declaration that sounded like something straight out of the Nixon White House tapes. Van Brocklin loved Richard Nixon. He also hated Richard Nixon. What's interesting though is that the media didn't simply write him off as an asshole. They described him as a complete enigma, a man they just could not figure out. I think they knew that he was always kinda halfway serious, that he realized he'd never escape criticism no matter what he did, so there was no harm in upping the volume. On the field, Van Brocklin sorta righted the ship and curbed the outright freefall of the early years. In 1971, he led the Falcons to their first winning season. 2 years later, they ripped off 7 straight wins and found themselves at 8-4, well within reach of the NFC's wildcard spot. Best of all, their schedule was finally getting to the easy part. Up next were the 3-win St. Louis Cardinals, who had been completely wrecked by injuries in recent weeks. The Falcons even had home field advantage. This shouldn't have even been a contest. And it wasn't. The stage was set for what, to this very day, is easily one of the most agonizing, hideous NFL games ever played. You heard Alex mention passer rating. This is a metric that takes into account a quarterback's passing yards, completion percentage, touchdowns scored, and interceptions thrown. Mathematically, the best passer rating possible is 158.3, but few quarterbacks have ever managed that. In 2020, the average passer rating was about 93. The passing game has evolved dramatically over the last 50 years, as you can see. Back in 1973, the league average was about 65. Now, this metric has kind of a sick sense of humor. Imagine if on every play, the quarterback took the ball, turned sideways, and threw it to a hot dog vendor in the crowd. Just straight up goes 0 for 20. No completions, no touchdowns, no interceptions. Because of the way the math is structured, his passer rating would sit at 39.6. So going lower than that is pretty humiliating. You get there by throwing interceptions. And if you're apocalyptically bad, it's mathematically feasible for you to get to absolute zero, the lowest possible rating. Since 1950, there have only been 91 instances of a passer throwing at least 10 passes and still finishing with a flat zero. Even back then, this only happened a couple times a year across the entire NFL. On this day against the Falcons in 1973, Cardinals quarterback Gary Keithley suffered this indignity. So did Bob Lee, the Falcons quarterback. Both starting quarterbacks finished with a passer rating of 0.0 in the same game. To this day, this is the only time this has ever happened. A game would have to be played in a hurricane for this to ever happen again. There's no explanation for it. There's no explanation for Pat Sullivan, the Falcons backup who replaced Lee, running up the gut and just dropping the ball with nobody in his solar system. There's no explanation for star linebacker Greg Brazina doing the same, recovering a fumble only to fumble it himself and watch the Cardinals take it in for 6 points. It was the most thorough mockery of the quarterback position ever seen in the NFL. And Norm Van Brocklin, once the greatest quarterback in America, had to watch it all happen right in front of him. Couldn't even muster any anger after the game. There was no big blow-up, no long diatribe about the Teapot Dome scandal or whatever. He just seemed sad. The loss ultimately torpedoed their playoff chances, and it precipitated another freefall that lasted several years. Van Brocklin saved his greatest performance for the very end, after a 42-7 hammering at the hands of the Miami Dolphins in 1974 that dropped the Falcons to 2-6. Today's coaches throw fits. Yeah, they'll yell at reporters or try to make them look stupid, but none of them are Norm Van Brocklin, who stood at the podium that day and basically said, "Fuck it, I will fight you all," challenging every reporter in the room to a fistfight, right then and there, straight up. No one took him up on it. I think everyone knew that he 100% meant it. He was fired the next day, and he never coached in the NFL again. To fans who'd wanted him fired for years, Norm Van Brocklin's inability to get to the playoffs eclipsed the fact that he'd built the Falcons into a team that could actually win a few games. When he passed away 9 years later, some of those in the media continued to insist that there was more to this man than most understood. Most didn't see the quintessential family man who melted down whenever he was around children, or insisted on visiting a sick young Falcons fan every day after practice. That isn't how Norm Van Brocklin went down in history. He didn't seem to care whether or not we saw that side of him. Nobody's ever any one person.
Through the first 6 years of play for the Atlanta Falcons, they never had a running back reach 1,000 rushing yards. The closest anyone had come was when Junior Coffey rushed for 722 yards in each of the franchise's first 2 seasons. Then before 1972, the team traded for Packers running back Dave Hampton. In Hampton's first year in Atlanta, he'd rushed for 930 yards heading into the final week of the season, in strong position to crack the 1,000-yard milestone. While not near Jim Brown's then record of over 1,800 yards, that 1,000-yard barrier's historically been a big badge of honor for running backs. At halftime of that game, he was named the Falcons' most valuable player and was presented with a giant trophy. Later in the fourth quarter, he indeed hit that 1,000-yard mark, and the game stopped so Hampton could be given a game ball and the home crowd could voice their appreciation. Then, this happened. 6-yard loss. Took him down to 994 yards. Hampton would get only one more carry for one more yard, finishing the season with 995. Just like that, poof, that magical 1,000-yard season had vanished into thin air. Hampton was crushed. He really, really wanted that comma in his rushing total, and to actually get it and then lose it was an extremely bitter pill to swallow. But hey, there's always next year, right? And what do you know, Hampton was once again in striking distance of 1,000, entering the Falcons' last game in 1973. It appeared his best efforts would again fall just short as he was stuck on 982 when they missed a field goal with under 2 minutes remaining. A subsequent interception, however, gave new life for Hampton to accomplish his goal that was so cruelly ripped from his grasp a year earlier. Feeding Hampton was Atlanta's only objective, and he picked up 10 yards across his next 2 carries, pulling within 8 yards of 1,000 with still enough time for 4 more carries. Those 4 carries produced 5 yards. Dave Hampton had followed up his 1,000-turn 995-yard season with a 997-yard season. Once again, he was torn up about it. Once more, there's always next year though, right? Actually, the next year, his 1974 season was derailed by injury, but hey, there's always the year after next, right? This was a burning desire with a flame that never faded. Hampton returned for training camp in 1975, a man on a mission for his 1,000 yards. He again had 900-something yards heading into the finale, a trip to his old stomping grounds in northeast Wisconsin. Winning was always the top priority for Hampton, who certainly didn't want to reach the milestone in lieu of team success. But that still wasn't going to stop him. There was simply no way, after all the twists and turns the football gods bestowed upon him over the last 3 years, that he was going to be denied here. Unfortunately for Hampton, his Falcons trailed by multiple scores for most of the second half, necessitating an air-based attack to try and get back in the game. But the story changed a bit when the Packers iced things late. So in the waning minutes of a freezing game that was out of reach, with Hampton at 972 yards on the season, the Falcons shifted into Operation Fulfill Hampton's Dream. An explosive 22-yard burst had him knocking on the door, and after breaking through on his next carry to reach 1,000 for the second time in his career, he called it a season, staying above 1,000 for the first time in his career.
Dave Hampton played one more injury-plagued season after that, and then he retired. He got it in right under the bell. Sure, a 1,000-yard season pales in comparison to some of the numbers other running backs were putting up at the time, but the Falcons just aren't there right now. They can't even come close to contending with the NFL's elite, the Steelers and Cowboys and whatnot. What these guys need is a companion. Now, there are some of you watching right now who are delighting in all of this. Every Falcons defeat, every fumble, every meltdown on and off the field, you're loving every second of it, aren't you? Well, don't worry. Didn't forget about you. The Atlanta Falcons and the New Orleans Saints, the NFL's Beavis and Butthead. You'd have to venture into the white-hot rage dimension of college sports to find a rivalry this intense. In professional sports, there's no rivalry like this one anywhere in America. Forget rivalries like Lakers-Celtics or Yankees-Red Sox that you're told you care about. There have been a few that burned with the heat of 1,000 suns, like Bulls-Pistons or Habs-Nordiques, but this is the only one that's been able to sustain that degree of hatred for half a century. Of all the possible matchups in the NFL, only 31 have been played at least 100 times, and Falcons-Saints is one of them. In almost all of these prolonged rivalries, one or both teams have won more games than they've lost throughout history. Up here, you've got two big historical winners, the Packers and Bears, who'd been duking it out for a century to various degrees of intensity. Down here, you've got Packers-Lions and Patriots-Jets, two pairings that are very much a big brother beating up on the little brother. Closer to the middle, you'll see a lot of the same AFC West teams that have been bottled up in the same tiny division, scrapping like rats in an outhouse for decades. These are teams that are traditionally competitive to one degree or another. And this is what makes Saints-Falcons so special. Two teams that have lost way more than they've won, meeting a couple times a year to beat on each other, because they couldn't beat on anybody else.
As a Falcons fan, there's no such thing as respecting the Saints in any shape or form. It's something I was taught from the very beginning of entering this sad fandom. At first, I didn't even really know why I was supposed to hate the Saints. It was just something that my uncles and older brother told me to do if I wanted to be a true fan. In so many words, I was told, in this household, we don't mess with the Saints. Period. So that was that. With every matchup, I would watch the rage build up inside of them, as they shouted at the TV with a little more extra flair than usual because it was Aints Week. I was hooked from there. What makes this matchup so special is the pure pettiness from both fan bases. Of course, we hate each other, but it's hard to find more entertaining shit-talking that you can find between the people of Atlanta and New Orleans. It's roasting at its finest. The Falcons could legitimately go 2-14 on the season, but as long as those two wins come against the Saints, Falcons fans would still be insufferable.
Sports rivalries often take decades to form. This one sprung up almost immediately. It's Week 11 in the 1967 season, the Saints' first season and the Falcons' second. Both teams are terrible. This is the first time they ever meet in the regular season, and for most of the afternoon, it looks like Atlanta's finally going to pick up an easy win.
After all, they were cruising early, having jumped out to a 21-3 lead in the second quarter. Slowly but surely, the Saints score 17 unanswered points to pull within 1 in the fourth quarter. The Falcons respond by kicking a field goal to go up 4 with under 4 minutes left. New Orleans gets one final chance to complete their unlikely comeback from down 18, but the Falcons are in good shape. They just gotta defend their end zone against the opposing backup quarterback. Even as the Saints march their way down into the red zone, it's not long before they're staring down the barrel of a 4th and 14 with the game on the line. Quarterback Billy Kilmer's first read is wideout Flea Roberts in the flat, but he quickly looks the other way before firing a pass downfield into the end zone that gets picked off. Game over. Except there's a reason he didn't throw to the flat. Falcons DB Jerry Richardson had apparently committed pass interference against Roberts, even if he disputes the timing of the alleged infraction. The Saints, with new life, go on to score the game-winning touchdown, then defensively hang on by a thread to win the first chapter of this storied rivalry.
This was the first of 103 body blows and counting that the Falcons and Saints will deal each other. It was excruciating for Falcons fans to see their team build a 21-3 lead, only to lose in the end. See, you gotta get to 28. Make it 28-3 and you're golden. Those of you who have read ahead know that both these teams would go on to do a good amount of winning at some point or another, but this era was all about two bad teams learning how to hate each other. After losing their first encounter, the Falcons ripped off 9 wins in a row against the Saints. Many of these were routs, but one in particular was a clobbering that made history. This is every instance in the post-merger era in which a team lost on their home field by at least 35 points. You typically only see this happen once or twice a year in the NFL. You never see this, a 55-point loss in front of your home fans. Approximately half the population of Metro Atlanta scored a touchdown in this one. After Saints quarterback Archie Manning was knocked out, backup Bob Davis came in and managed to pass a rating of 1.7. Let's jump back over here just a minute. We've already established that a passer rating of 0 is abysmal, but to approach it as closely as 1.7 without actually reaching it, you have to do something really gnarly, and that's what Davis did. His total passing yardage at the end of the day was -5. Davis is one of only 3 to attempt at least 10 passes and still somehow finish below 0 yards. The Falcons were running out of ways to humiliate the Saints that day. Those of you who have older siblings will surely see him in Ken Burrow, who, after hauling in touchdown number 6,000, taunts everyone in the building who's bothered to stick around this long. You gonna spike it? Nope. You gonna spike it again? Nope. Yep. Y'all ain't worth it. I mean, it's a tale as old as time. The Falcons themselves suffered plenty of bulldozings in this era, most notably a 59-0 loss to the Rams that ranks among the worst the NFL's ever seen. As youngsters, the Falcons were having a lot of trouble at school. This is why they needed the Saints. Go out there, get shoved around, come back home to the South, pick a fight with their sibling. That's how they dealt with it. But although it didn't seem like it, the Falcons in the mid-1970s were right on the precipice of two things. First, they were about to invent new and more devastating ways to beat the Saints. And second, they were about to enter an era that most fans today have completely forgotten. These Atlanta Falcons didn't want to make the decades-long slog toward respectability that most new teams settle for. They wanted to win a Super Bowl now.